want to talk about the dark side of self-help. And I don't mean all of the toxic people and charlatans and abusers that make themselves out to be like self-help gurus, although that's a major problem. I'm actually talking about the modalities themselves and how some of our brain chemistry works, where we can actually end up in a situation where very helpful frameworks end up being a problem for us. They end up being a way for us to dissociate and continue to essentially disconnect from other people around us because we're constantly trying to improve ourselves. And that could be through like religious or spiritual baselines, coaching or therapeutic baselines, or even like trying to be progressive enough or, thoughtful enough or self-aware enough about social justice issues. And one of the things that we have to talk about with this is how much this can be a problem where we are actually hyper intellectualizing the entire situation so that we don't have to feel connected, that we don't have to take risk, so that we don't have to be messy. And it's a form of control and dissociation. So when we look at constantly trying to improve ourselves and constantly going to therapy and constantly needing to dig through every bit of trauma we have or constantly work on our boundaries, and in doing so justify why we can't be in a relationship right now, why we can't seek out partners or friends, why we can't go try that new thing, why we can't go down a new career field for a job because, well, I can see all those patterns and all those patterns say that this career field is no longer going to be a thing, so I can't have what I want. And it's a justification through this pattern recognition. It's a justification for keeping yourself small. It's a justification for keeping yourself in a specific place because then you don't have to live life. And it's a form of control. It's a form of dissociation. It's a form of distancing yourself from the experience of life as well as from other people. Because if you are justifying why you can't have friends because you're not healed yet or you aren't healed enough, and then it can also turn into a almost narcissistic self-absorption for some people. And it can turn into this idea of like, I have healed so much in my life and now I can't find any partners who are worthy of me because they're all so messy. Because then it can turn into a form of I am further along the path than them and therefore nobody is on my level. And it can turn to a form of elitism and this even narcissism in the idea of like constantly being self-absorbed on this, like I'm getting better, I'm healing, I'm doing these things, I've learned all about, my privilege and they haven't, and I'm not going to be around people who haven't learned that yet. I understand there's reasons to have good boundaries around not being around hateful people. And yet there's also a kind of tendency for a lot of people who are hyper intellectual that they push into this idea of like, no, I'm going to keep my circle closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, where they can justify not ever taking a risk on being in relationship with anybody. Because it's safer and neater and cleaner to be an elitist. It's easier to say that I am either better than other people or I am worse than other people in a way that doesn't allow you to actually have genuine connection or genuine relationship, because that might just be too messy. It is a form of distancing. And this plays out in social justice environments all the time. People who refuse, if someone says one wrong word or one wrong idea, they get dogpiled. This is a consistent thing because lots of people are out there projecting their insecurities and their shame onto the rest of the world. This is a consistent problem, but also it can play out just interpersonally where you are consistently thinking that you need to focus entirely on healing every bit of trauma you have. And as such, you then end up in a situation where you don't feel like you can connect to anyone because all you have seen is the trauma inside of yourself instead of actively building and growing experiential relationships with other people. And it can cause a disconnection and a sense of like, I like my neat little world and I'm not going to make any kind of compromise with anybody because that's my boundaries. And instead what you're doing is making yourself a glass vault, and you are trying to create a sterile environment for which you can have this glorious environment that's just for you. But that is not actually experiencing life in a lot of ways. It's containing you as much as possible in your controllable environment. And that level of intellectualization can be its own jail cell, really. It can be its own prison cell in putting you into a place where you cannot get out of it, because every time you want to take a risk, you can talk yourself out of it mentally. You can pattern recognition yourself into a corner and say, I can't do anything, either because the world will never understand me, or the people will never understand me, or I'm better than them, or I'm worse than them, or I'm whatever. You can talk yourself out with all of this pattern recognition. You can talk yourself out of any risk, of any relationship, of any kind of possible thing that's outside of your control, because, well, you have figured out what's best for you and you're not going to compromise. Except it's not about necessarily what's best for you. It's you putting yourself into this sterile kind of chamber, trying to keep yourself in the sense of power and control in all moments, because you don't have tolerance for fear, for anxiety, for the unknown. And that can be a problem, because even with these very helpful modalities, those factors can use those modalities as a means of justifying your own avoidance. So I just wanted to bring this up because it's something I'm seeing pretty consistently lately, and I do struggle with some of these ideas myself. So I just think it's really important for us to understand, even though therapy can be very helpful, some people can get caught on this treadmill of like self-improvement to the point where it becomes elitism or supremacy or another excuse to justify their distance from actually embodying themselves and being someone who experiences life, who actually goes out there and does things, who actually has relationships, and who accepts the messiness in both themselves and in the people around them.